Hi, I'm Trent Burton, and welcome to CAMP's first ever episode of The Summit. It's my pleasure to be joined by 6 talented and amazing designers today. We have Emily, Paul, Ricardo, Casey, Lauren, and Elle. So I noticed you all had different ways you kind of got into the business. I think one thing that maybe drives me as a creative person sometimes is when a project comes in, I start looking for certain things about it that I know I can make something out of it. What do you guys look for in a project when it comes into you? It doesn't really matter scale or scope. I'm more interested in what you see as the opportunity.
So something that really excites me is when there is the opportunity to solve a problem that never been solved before. So when it comes to invent something that ideally help improve people's life, but otherwise is a space that is quite new and you need for the first time to tackle certain challenges. That for me is super, super exciting. And you get to push a little bit the boundaries of what is known.
And so it sounds to me like you're looking oftentimes to invent a solution rather than just sort of put something you've already have thought for.
Yeah, let's say that when you work with latest technologies, in a way is easier to innovate because you have new ingredients that you can use to solve certain problems. But it's not necessarily only that. It's not just about new technologies. It's more about new type of experiences that you can create. So if there's a way to either help people think in a different way or see the world in a different way or experience something for the first time, that's actually super exciting for me.
Do you have a particular process that you use to tackle a problem like that?
There's a creative process that probably is not very different from the creative process that many other people that follow the design thinking process use. Just like research, get really familiar with it, very knowledgeable about the space, ideation and validation. So a lot of prototyping, a lot of hands-on work, and really try the experience with real people to see if you're actually providing the value that you want to provide or not.
So most of his projects, it seems there is an end user, someone who takes what you've created and uses it. In the 2D world, you've got your background book design. Do you think about it the same way?
Well, I think that the thing I was thinking about while you were talking was that I think that answer to your original question probably has a lot to do with scale. Because as you were just talking about it, I was like, you know what? I need to come up with some methodology to weed out these knuckleheads I end up working with all the time. I'm kidding. But, for me, there's smaller projects, so it's more like, oh, there's another project from They Might Be Giants. Let's do it. It's much more intuitive, probably. But I think that has to do way more with scale. A book cover. Well, look, you mentioned book covers. You read the book, so that is definitely a filtering mechanism. I don't want to read. There's a lot of stuff you don't want to read. If you don't want to read it, I don't want to be doing a cover for it. Over the years, I've found that I read a lot, but I only read books that I'm designing cover for. So it's a weird way to filter what you read, but you're reading all the time anyway. So it's really important to make decisions about what you're going to read first in that particular situation. But Emily's got a situation at Pentagrams very different, and it's been interesting. Well, it's been interesting. Hearing how projects happen and how, when a project comes into Pentagrams, a very different type of situation. Dear?
I'm very curious to know what you mean.
Well, the phone rings, and often, apparently, and the partners sort of jump on projects is the best way I can describe it. From what I hear, they should have like I don't quite understand how the decision is made as to what partner gets one thing and another one. You guys should have thumb wrestling to make the decisions. I don't know, but as I said, dear, you want to? I'm just digging myself deeper into the hole here.
Let's just keep going here.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
I think what Paul is trying to say is you have a more traditional structure at the agency where you take on projects based on whether you pitched for them or whether someone's come to you.
But wait a minute. This is not traditional. I don't think this is traditional because it's sort of like a jump ball. It seems like a jump ball.
Oh,
like
internally.
whoever responds to this thing first. No?
Go on.
Or it seems like whoever wants to do it more.
It depends on the project. 90% of the projects come in partner specific. Like 90% of the projects come in because, someone has worked with Michael or Paula or the other Michael or Eddie. Like they come in and they say, I saw this thing, I really liked that, so I would like to speak to the person who did that. That's what most of the work is. Or, you just get a call specifically about you, one. There are a handful of projects which we call the over the transom projects, which is just people who want to just either work for or have Pentagram pitch because Pentagram is
I guess that's
famous.
what I was describing. That's where
And
my interest
there
lies.
have
Because
been-
I really want to
there
see how they decide.
There have been, over the course of the years, different ways that has been handled. And it's actually a very fluid process because we still haven't quite figured it out. There was a long period of time where it was literally like whoever got their hand on the buzzer first, either got the project or certainly went to the first meeting and then was like, someone's not for me, you want it? But now we are trying to have a more sort of democratic so that if you're in the subway when a really good project comes through, you don't get to miss out. So we have a sort of filtering process.
When that happens, back to sort of the original intent of the question is what do you look for? When does it say, yeah, this one's for me, you back off?
So, well, it's usually pretty clear. And everyone, the cool thing about Pentagram is all the partners are really looking out for each other. Like everyone is always thinking about whether the other person is light on work or whether this theme seems more specific or a project comes in that might be great for two partners to collaborate on. It's very open and very socialistic process. And it's actually, as a newer partner, it's actually fascinating to me how generous the process really is. But when projects come to me, because I've sort of gotten into this niche of sort of entertainment industry and some amount of comedy, like when projects come in that feel like that aren't directly related to me, they usually get sort of pushed over to me. But a lot of projects come in, and what I want when a project comes in, when someone calls me specifically, is someone who I want to do good, smart work for good, smart people. Like that's my goal in what I do moving forward. And it has to be something that interests me, that feels alive, that can have a little bit of wit, which doesn't mean it has to be funny, but has to have a spark and has to be something where we can bring to it something other than, what color the box it comes in is.
Lauren, as a freelancer or someone who sort of, does their work based on what comes in, what's that philosophy for you? Because I imagine there are paying gigs and there are gigs that you get excited about. Is there a difference?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I do a fair amount of client work, and like you said, as a freelancer, it's kind of whatever. I have very little control over, usually it's either like a flood or like maybe a little bit trickling in at a time. So I tend to say yes to most things, but I'm a big kind of self-initiated project person. And because the thing, I do hand lettering, and so I'm a commercial hand letterer. So a lot of the projects I get hired for, I have no control. Like the copy is predetermined. They pretty much know what they want. I have a pretty defined style. So oftentimes I do find myself doing kind of the same, like just executing. And I can definitely do that. And I really enjoy lettering. It's very therapeutic for me to focus like letter form by letter form. It's a good way to slow down. But because I went to ad school, the thing that excites me is like the idea behind the project and if there's an interesting concept or a surprising way to, tell a story. So for me, I use my passion projects to do that. So I guess it's kind of a balance. I do a lot of passion projects because my boyfriend always jokes that the way I take a break from work is by working more. And I don't know if you guys do that too, but, just doing things for fun or doing things. I think I agree with what Emily said about, having a little bit of wit, and especially when the copy is predetermined for me, I don't always have the luxury of being able to be like, you should probably change it to this. Like I've done projects where there's like a grammatical error before and like the copy is pre-approved, like I'm the letterer. I did just work on a really cool project. I don't know if this has ever happened for you guys, but my ad teacher used to teach us that you pitch 3 versions of something. You pitch the boring version, the crazy version, and then they usually go for like the average version that you pitch. So I did that, and they went for the crazy version, which was cool. So I just installed a 3-dimensional paper mache mural over in New York, and that totally ended up biting me in the butt because it took 5 days to install instead of 3. But that was definitely fun. So something I look for is just a client who's willing to, I think, trust my lettering skills, but give me room to play. And not always the case, but once in a while.
So, Elle, I noticed with the kind of work you do, it tends to have a larger social goal in mind, whether it's a museum or, of course, the 9/11 space. When they're not easy, short-term kinds of projects. So, how do you go into something like that, and what keeps you motivated, and what to continue to create over time?
Well, we have a fair variety of projects from, let's say, 3 to 6 to 9 month projects, up to then big museums that will keep you busy for 2-3 years. Sometimes they also go on hold for fundraising. So there's a good variety in that regard. But for me, it's crucial that if I enter a 2-3 year project, I have to be interested in the content, and it has to be meaningful to me to spend a lot of time with the people as well as with the content we're trying to convey. And there are 2 things. The one thing is we are mostly trying to sort of come up with new approaches to storytelling and to come up with new approaches to education by breaking the habitual patterns that we usually expect in museums or in the public space. So it also takes somebody on the other side who's willing to do that. So we just actually won a project in Sydney in Australia where I asked the client, why would you want to work with us? It's going to be tricky. Like, we're very far away from each other. And they specifically wanted exactly that attitude. And so for that, we're flying there, and we're doing that because there's somebody who wants to break the rules just as much as we do. Not for the sake of breaking rules, but in order to, for us, it's really the moment you stop doing what you're doing by routine, like attention increases, memory retention increases. That's where, for me, the spark is there. As a meditator, it goes back to this idea of sort of breaking the logic of the everyday and then just being the here and now. So if I can offer that actually to people, it's really precious to me.
Let's talk about rules for a second then, because that's a really interesting point. What do you think of rules, and how do you approach dealing with them, or do you have them? I find, on my side of things, there are a lot of rules because I'm in advertising, and it's just the way it goes. But I think when you approach things, how do you view rules? As a constraint or as somewhere to start? What do you think?
I was just going to say, didn't we all become designers because we needed the rules? Like, wouldn't we all be fine artists? If, like, I like the rules, and then I like pushing at them wherever I can.
Yeah, to a point.
Well, you don't really like them.
No, I do. I like the rules. I think design is reactionary. That's a basic aspect of it. Now, whether the thing you're reacting to are an impossible set of rules, I mean, that. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, reinventing the rules is really interesting. Like, you take the rules that you have and you find a way to sort of change what they are, or sort of find a way to redefine what that rule is. That's sort of the exciting reason for rules to be there. I guess they're meant to be broken.
I think that's what I was referring to when I was talking to you, is you've got a really, at Work & Co, kind of an interesting model in that you make products, you make things, digital things, but how do the rules affect that? Usability, whatever. I mean, I'm interested to find out how your process is.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the rules are really important in what we do, right? Because we're designing things for people to use every day. So if we break those rules, the products that we're designing can be, broken. So I personally don't think a lot about breaking the rules. I think about evolving the rules, So, how can we take a product or some type of experience that a user is going to have with these applications or websites that we're creating, and start with the basics and the fundamentals, like what's a really clear and simple way for a user to get to the end goal, whatever that end goal is for that product. And let's make sure that we meet that goal and meet it as quick as possible and prototype that out and get it in users' hands and let them give us feedback and design around that. And then once we nail those fundamentals, then we can evolve it and push it and try to break the rules a little bit further. But I think we don't talk a lot about breaking the rules, just more about like evolving design, I think, user experience design.
So is your process iterative? Do you continue to just work your way through?
Yeah, we tend to, when we start a project, when we get a brief or a strategy from a client, as quick as possible, our goal is as quickly as possible to get into prototype and put something in front of users, because at the end of the day, like everything that we do, everything that we create is for people, is for users. So the sooner we can get something in front of them and get that feedback, I think the better that product's going to be. And then we just iterate on that. And we prototype. Every project that we do is like really deeply involved in prototyping. And we have a belief at Work & Co that we prototype when we don't present. So we don't show up to client meetings with big, elaborate keynote presentations. We come with the products and the prototypes and put it in front of clients. And that I think the sooner you can get something in your hands and use it, it just makes a lot more sense in terms of like.
Why do you think it's different for products? Because I think maybe others around the table, if you said, I'm going to put my ideas in front of the consumer, so to speak, early on in the process, that would be the worst thing you could do, because it would tend to make them, death by committee, so to speak, water things down. Why is it so different from what you do?
Yeah, and I want to be careful how much I talk about user testing, because I think a lot of what we do too is you have to use your instincts, and there are certain products and certain things that we're designing that we will use our gut and our instincts to design, because we're users too, right? I think the reason why it's probably a little bit more important in our field is because the users have to be able to achieve a goal. If you're designing a banking app, right, and your goal is to, use that application to manage your finances, if you can't do that, if users can't do that, then that's a failed product. So I think it's really important and critical for us to get a lot of feedback from users through that iterative process.
Do you work the same way at Microsoft?
So Microsoft is big, so different groups work in different way. Like on campus, there are 44,000 people. So it's like, I'm sure that people do things different.
I'm sorry.
44,000 people only on campus.
Wow.
54?
44.
44.
Oh, 44.
44, right, sorry.
Much different.
It's a lot of people. So I think in general, when it comes, so I used to work in advertisement before and then in product design. And I think that, so it's very different if you're doing a campaign versus if you're doing a product. Both because one, you pay people to see it, basically, and the other, people have to pay to use it. If you do a product, people have to pay. And also something that people keep on using versus they're supposed once, right? So it's very different type of, experiences and products. Something that is very important that you were touching on is design research as a field. So often there is a little bit of reaction against design research because it sounds like you're asking users or people what you have to do. That is a misunderstanding of what it is. So when Ford said, if I ask people what they wanted, they'll say the faster horse instead of, he came up with a car. So talking to the users or, customers, however you want to call them, is about sometimes understand their needs very deeply, their context, their situation. Some other times is to test if the solution you're proposing leverage on other capabilities. That's when, talk about accessibility or usability. You want to do something and your assumption is people understand how to use it. If they can't, it doesn't work. So it's something that you can test. It's different than creating a movie or even creating an experience that creates certain emotion. You don't ask for creative direction to the users. Your role as a product designer is to know best, but you need to really see your users as a way to validate your ideas as fast as possible. So the process, I think, again, is similar to human-centered design. So generally, you try to become very, very knowledgeable about the space. You do research, you learn about the user, but that applies also to campaigns. You want to learn about what's been done before. Who is the audience for what I'm doing. And similarly to products, you want to know, you want to do a marketing analysis. You want to understand what else is out there. What is the real problem? What is the root problem that you're trying to solve for certain people? Also, you want to better understand your company and what are your goals. And then you come up with a lot of ideas. But you don't know if these ideas work or not. There are assumptions. No one can know. So you go into prototyping as soon as possible because you want to test if your ideas work. And testing with users is one of the different ways of getting feedback.
Elle, what's the process for you? Because you seem to be, you're sort of the outlier here in the sense that what you do, while very much about, yeah, a little bit. And so I wonder how, hearing both sides of that story, where do you fit? Or how would you do it?
On both sides a little bit. Well, coming from Europe, in Europe I had this classic sort of process where you get the brief and you disappear and you come back and you hope you have a similar aesthetic sensibility, etc. And then if not, then it lands in taste discussions. Or if you have a more dispersed stakeholder group, then sometimes they sort of fight over their tensions on the platform of the design, which both I think is incredibly painful. So when I joined Bruce Ma Design, I really enjoyed their process that starts with research, sort of in that field too, but then does a lot of stakeholder interviews, individually, group workshops, whatever is needed, depending on how complex it is. And then for me, the magic sauce is really before you even start ideation, you synthesize this and present those insights back, but translate them basically into design guidelines. So it's not only the synthesis around the core insights, but also what they actually mean in terms of design principles. And I want to get that signed off from them. And I want to have the whole stakeholder group in the room. Because then it's really no surprise anymore what you come back with. But it's also, for me, super helpful as a creative director, because then it's also not my taste discussion with my team, but we're every meeting I have these design principles up and I'm like, are we meeting this? Does this do justice to what we promised we will do? So it kind of brings the team, me and the client all really into one line. And whenever I don't do it, it always bites me. And it really works. Sometimes it's truly magic with the most difficult client groups where they later come back and they're like, how did you manage that it was just so smooth? And so it works. That works really, really well for me. But it's not always that easy. It's that's just sort of, for me, definitely the ideal scenario. And then, of course, we prototype like crazy after that too. As soon as we're out of rough concept, it's just prototyping. And I mean, sometimes we also prototype already in concept, depending on what it is.
I'm totally interested in the personalities behind the different things that designers do. Because, what we're describing here is maybe function. And, it's just funny because, I was years over this design firm called Carlson Wilker in New York. And I was upstairs doing op-ed illustrations and solving problems, visual problems, especially when it's a Times op-ed. There's an editorial. It's about something. There's a specific point of view. I always feel like you have to bring yourself into it. Your point of view is important too. And I have a certain way of approaching that. And then, I'd go downstairs and they were working on something for some band, and it's design, it's reactionary. But if you start listening to the music and go, okay, what are the people listening to this going to want to see or need to see when looking at this thing? It's just it just needs to be a kitten. It has nothing to do with whatever it is. And I've seen them a couple of times. They were stuck. What do you think? Well, it should be this, that, and the other thing. And the client's like, no, we want this crazy stuff. We don't want this to make sense. So again, it just depends on. But again, I think it gets back to personality.
I think that one problem is also that we talk about design as if it was a thing that we can pin down. We're talking about products. We're talking about things that people have to use every day.
Yeah.
Things that, hey, if it doesn't work, someone dies, versus something that if it doesn't work, you don't like it.
Right.
It's a different,
Right.
So I think there's also a matter of, being precise in pinning down, okay, what is design, really?
And which designers, again, based on your personality and your past, gravitate to certain things. I mean, book covers are another perfect example. There are people who design interiors, and they're considering they're designers, just as the cover designer is a designer. It's a totally different way of looking at it. And one person might be miserable doing that, and the other person would be in their ideal environment in terms of what they're designing, So I think it does come down to us at a certain point.
It's also, I think, a question if you're in the more like maybe graphic design realm, if there's a sort of a personal style with some feathers, so to say, or if it's more about, and especially if you're more or less a one-man show, you kind of bridge a little bit more the artist-designer boundary. While for me, like with having a whole team, like for me, funny enough, other people see sort of a common thread through my work and through the aesthetic. I think it's very driven by for whom it is, and I really try to sort of get under their skin. But of course, at the same time, there are things like my work is usually pretty vibrant. There's usually sort of an impact to it, and it's also the kind of clients that I attract, and it has, of course, a lot to do with my personality too. So there's, for me, with like this like Spanish passion, and then there's this like rigorous German like grid, logic, efficiency, structure, and then let's break it and go like. So, I mean, you attract also people with and projects who sort of like want that energy too.
How important is it for you guys to, even on some sort of subconscious level, for there to be some of you in what you do? I mean, I think particularly someone like yourself, there's a lot of you in what you do because it's very much style-driven and it comes from you. I think someone like yourself, Casey, would be a bit harder to do something like that. Is it important? Does it matter?
But you touched on that. I mean, that you have to feel your way sometimes, even within.
I think it matters. I mean, it may not come out visually, but I have to selfishly feel excited and motivated to work on whatever that project is. If it's not something that I would want to use every day, then I'm not excited to design it. And you touched on something really important too, is like the team, and we work on pretty big projects, and it's a team, and it's not just designers, it's developers and strategists, right? And are they excited? Are they motivated? And can they see themselves in that work too? And I think that's one thing we think about a lot too. And it's back to your question about, what motivates you to take on a project. And one thing we always ask ourselves as a partnership group is this good for the team? Or the teams that, have to work day in, day out to design or build or ideate this product, are they going to be excited? And is it something that they can see themselves in?
The way we work, I think, is very similar. Like, we do a lot of research at the beginning of something, and we do a lot of like sort of saying back to the client, this is what we learned. We do a lot of interviews. We do a lot of like historical research. It's really part of it. And I always say that in the end, though, what we do should look more like you, the client, than it should look like us. But there is a huge part of me and my team in everything we do. It's the reason that we're passionate about it. It's the reason that people come to us. We are in there, and especially we also do a lot of writing with the work that we do, but it's the joy that we get from that sort of collaborative process with the client that's really important, that helps there be our essence in everything we do, without it necessarily being like visually. Like, I like work that you can't go like, oh, that person exactly did that. But the sort of idea behind it, or the essence, or the thinking behind it makes you think about someone specific. That's what we try to do with all the projects we take on. And that's why we take on certain projects where we feel like we can bring what we have in our souls into what the story someone else is trying to tell in a good way that sort of evolves or enhances it.
is it going to be a great experience? That's like the end product or the thing that you're making is obviously so important, but 10, 15 years from now, like you're going to remember the experience and the team that that's lifetime. Like the products and things that we design may come and go, but I think that's so critical and so undervalued, right? Just like the relationships and with the clients and with your teams, like that bond that you make going through like creating something is really important.
This was originally going to be a question just for Paul, but I think it's also for you in that, what's the difference? I think, most of us work straight with clients and who aren't necessarily creative people all the time. I think you both have experience working with other creators. So you're creating for creators. Is that a different experience than creating, say, for a large airline or a cereal company or any of that sort of thing? Does it feel different?
I'll tell you once I do something for a large airline or a cereal company.
I prefer working with creative clients. I mean, I never, there's a lot of discussions you don't have to have. Maybe getting back to that point about having language that you need to use to make somebody understand what your role is going to be as a designer. I'm much more comfortable with the phone ringing and someone saying, hey, and then having a dialogue and already having an understanding of what this. I spent an early part of my career with people who would bring in, account executives who would bring in projects because they golfed with somebody, and it was miserable for me. Like the fact that someone comes to you because of something that you're doing, there's already an understanding and a value that's placed on it. Because, I don't know if everybody would agree, but I think design is more valued now than it ever has been. But maybe it's just the graphic designer talking at the table talking, but the world at large doesn't care, about design, I feel. I think that's changing. And I'm curious to see what some of you have to say about that, because I think it's misunderstood. I think when you run into somebody who really has an understanding of what design can do, whether it's a publisher or a band or whatever, again, I'm using my own experience. It's night and day, the experience of working in that situation, and the things that you can make are I think there's much better chance of it being good.
Have you had the same sort of experience?
I mean, I really like working with clients who are creative and who are, again, mostly what they have to be is passionate about what you're doing, like, and interested in the dialogue. Like clients who just sort of want us, like, yeah, show me. Okay, what's the next thing? That doesn't, one, produce good work, or two, really interest me. But a client who's really interested in sort of getting in there and having the conversation with you and letting you sort of bring something to the table that isn't exactly what they were thinking, and they understand the creative process, is really terrific. But I do have fantastic clients who are creative within their field that isn't just about like being in a creative industry like a TV show or a band or something like that. But who do something else but really care passionately and are really interested in the creative aspect of whatever it is they do and sort of changing that paradigm in some way. That's just as interesting to me as working with, people who do other creative things.
And I just want to make a point here that what I was saying earlier about people, generally there's not an understanding of design or appreciation for it, isn't to say that the design itself is that important. It's just that the things that design can do in any particular situation is misunderstood, I think, mostly.
I think it's also because what design is changed over time so much. And so it maybe started, if you think about what design is today, also because of digital, change a lot because of interaction, etc. So now I think there was an article or a post from, I think, Donald Norman or Bill Moogridge, one of the two, I don't know, basically talking about how design is at a fork where there is design as a craft and design as a way of thinking. Design as a craft, which is when you master the crafting of being able to make something look or feel great. And then there is a design way of thinking, and we're talking about design process and so on. So the word design itself means so much now that it's just chaotic, right? But I think that it's also on us to explain people that design is something bigger than what sometimes we even tell others. And in my mind, it's more about improving and enriching people's lives. Whether it's designing a Mac, whether it's designing a font, whether it's designing a cover, it's about enriching people's lives, right? And then I think that people appreciate it, but in their subconscious, and we need to help them understand what is the difference, but also be very critical in saying, okay, this one is not enriching people's life. This is something I like, but actually, people don't care. But I think we're lucky enough that companies out there that are successful, the most successful companies, are embracing design. So everybody else is reacting to that. So it's good in that sense.
I think, Lauren, you're an interesting case in that you're doing your own thing. Like you got your hustle on out there, right? You've sort of figured out.
One-woman show, yeah.
You've kind of figured out what it is you're about. And we were talking a little bit about inspiration, and I thought it was really interesting if you could talk a little bit about inspiration and sort of you thought you needed to look somewhere but didn't really.
Oh, you looked at the title of my design talk.
I did. But it's just, I think it's a really interesting way because you're all, not to co-opt the conversation here for a second, but I think people are always told to look, you've got to look afar and it's got to be a grand sort of gesture or statement. But I was interested to hear how you approach it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think when I was younger, I would think of inspiration as purely aesthetic. Like you would look at other great designers, you'd go around to museums and galleries and you'd kind of collect this kind of archive of visual inspiration. But I think because I went into advertising, I ended up drawing a lot of inspiration from ideas behind campaigns and that kind of stuff. So less aesthetic and more just conceptual. And so my whole premise as a designer has been, it's kind of like the lazy creative's guide to coming up with good ideas is why go search for it when you yourself as like a living human being, you have like this gold mine of experiences and emotions and feelings and things that have happened in your life that are true for you that probably are true for other people too. So my whole thing is just like, you don't have to search far and wide. Like you can, and I think this plays into product design, this plays into digital design, or even like for me, I'm an illustrator. You can, if you're solving a problem for yourself, you're probably solving it for a lot of other people too. Because, we all have different backgrounds and different experiences, but there are like some pretty common shared human experiences, and you can definitely use yourself to, draw inspiration for your work. So a lot of my client work, because it's lettering, and you were talking about rules a little bit, with, being a commercial hand letterer, I do have some pretty tight constraints because clients are technically paying me to make something look nice, but it needs to be legible at the end of the day. That's the most important part. If it's an ad campaign, I can try to pitch something a little bit, more decorative or artsy or kind of a different kind of type style than they wanted. But usually, clients will pick your least favorite sketch. Don't know why. But they'll go for the safer one, or they'll ask you to kind of trim it back. And you're like, why did you hire me in the first place? So with my personal work, I definitely, like to show more of my personality because there's no constraints with personal work. So I basically just draw from my own experiences. I take a lot of notes, like in my notebook and on my phone, of just like funny moments or things, random thoughts that kind of pass through my head that typically I used to kind of let slip and kind of fly by, but now I try to journal a little bit more. Kind of like what Emily was saying. I think essence was the perfect word when it comes to infusing yourself in your work, because I've been recently getting hired more. I'm a hand letterer, but I've been getting hired more to write the copy as well, which has been really fun for me because that is a surefire way for me to put my aesthetic and my tone of voice kind of into my work. And yeah, it ends up positioning me to work for brands that kind of share my same point of view and tone of voice. And those are the best clients to work for because there's kind of an unspoken language there.
Anyone else want to talk a little bit about inspiration, where they find it, how they feel about it? Is it something that you're constantly looking for, or do you feel like it's yourself? Is it motivation and inspiration two different things?
I I have a rule, if we talk about rules, for actually my team to not start with visual references. If we're talking about concepts and ideas, because then it's just a stolen variation. But sort of really come up with an idea from other that is not from the visual realm, and then just use reference in order to make a point about the look and feel or something specific or etc. And I think that it's important. And when I was still teaching in Germany, it started with all the design blocks, and then they would just, that's where they all got their same inspiration from. And I still laugh today when you know exactly from which school somebody's coming from. Like immediately know if somebody's from Yale or Art Center and it's just hilarious how they all have the same style.
Oh, it's super sad.
And so like I encourage them always very, very much to be aware of what is out there, but don't start there, and really find your own voice and find your own, either your own style, if you want to go more into the artistic direction, or find your own voice on how to answer a challenge and what is important to you, and just stop that whole trend shopping.
It's too easy. And if you have it in front of you, you're just going to, it's so hard to be like, I'll put it up in front of me, but I'm not going to copy it. You're going to absorb it. So I think that's really smart that you tell your team to not start with the visual.
I am so going to steal that.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Does it happen at
Thank you.
Pentagram where people will start with?
Well, it's different. I mean, I encourage my team to not start with, mood boards or whatever, but
Pinterest
to start with ideas. But I don't mind if then there's a thing that says like, and it might look and feel like this, or it might move like this if we're
Yes,
talking about a motion
like a
piece.
reference.
It helps. But I always say like, let's just start with the basic ideas. It doesn't have to be fancy. I don't care what typeface it is right away. I just want it to be about the idea. But having them, and I often will say like, and if you can best describe it in just a sentence, that's totally fine. But I love the idea of making them do that, of making them not even like to think about something and not even go to any visual reference, but to sort of find a way to talk about it and describe their idea, I think is really interesting.
It's easy in the experiential realm, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, because you don't just start at the computer. Like we start with sketches usually. And that's the thing I forced him to, like to come, like I need a visual sketch. I want a title, I want a one-line description, and you have your sketch, and then you add, if needed, like the visual references to it. But it really comes out of, for me, it comes a lot from reading, for example. It's really interesting when I read, I usually I develop a lot of ideas there.
But having them be able to talk about an idea really makes the idea a little bit deeper, I think. And even if it's a logo, if it's not experiential.
Yeah, but again, though, I'm sorry to cut you off.
Oh, sure, I'm used to it.
I think a lot of the mood board stuff is it's just a shortcut for time. That's why people do it. I think it's very difficult to really develop something from nothing, which we always want to do, but you're on the clock.
It's also never from nothing. I mean,
Yeah.
No, I
everything's
know, of course.
derivative of-
Don't get me wrong, I love mood boards. I think they're great. And I think that's inspiration. Like if you're thinking about something and you want it to relate to op art, spending time diving through and finding op art things that, sort of.
Well, yeah, and it gets.
That's
yeah.
my parents, when I was growing up, had like filing cabinets on flat files that they called their swipe files, which is basically Pinterest, but
in real life.
sheets of paper with a whole folder that just said butterflies or whatever.
But it's sort of fascinating how that's changing. You just see it, and no one says, "Oh, the blogs are dead. Now it's all Pinterest." You just realize it at a certain point.
It's not even Pinterest anymore.
What is it?
Don't you think it's Instagram? No?
Oh, no,
Pinterest, I guess
no.
it's still.
Well, I guess it's Instagram too. Well, maybe I didn't even know that. Okay. See,
Well,
we
now you
need
can create
to be
boards on
told
Instagram.
as these things happen. But there's the visual library over at the New York Public Library. You can go in there. There's a room, and it's just like somebody has made this enormous morgue over there, pulling things out of magazines
Right.
for dozens and dozens of years. And you used to go over there, and go through that stuff and look for stuff. I used to go to, I still do, go to the library and just after you've read the book or whatever it is you're doing and just start randomly pulling books off the shelf. You know, something that has absolutely nothing to do with what it is that you're doing. And then you see something and then it can lead you somewhere.
Yeah.
Again, it's probably the same thing, but I do think it has to do with time though. You know, it's a shortcut.
Yeah, you just hit on something that's kind of similar to how we view inspiration. Like in digital, there's not really much of a history to draw from, you know, for inspiration. I mean,
where is it anyway?
It's been around for 10 years, you know. So there's really not a lot for us to look at to be really inspired. And we don't create mood boards because we're making something digital, right? So for me personally, like I find it in other forms like architecture and product design and graphic design and music. Like it's not really a part of our process, but it's important as a designer to be inspired, right? So we often look for it in other mediums, not within digital, because it's just there's not much history to draw from, you know? And it's just changing like every month. There's something like new happening in digital that it's hard to stay relevant.
So I know that something that is interesting about the table is that we really see design from different perspectives, right? So I think that is something that enriches. And the contribution I want to make in terms of the type of design that I see and, you know, the type of design that I'm passionate about is the idea that, hey, through design we can advance human experience, right? So we can use design as a way of thinking to advance what the experience is for us. And if you think about it that way, it's interesting because there are sorts of inspirations that are maybe not conventional, that are science fiction and magic, which sounds stupid, but actually it is, because science fiction and magic are ideas, is people imagining what the future could look like, either based on science or just free of any limitation, right? So how, you know, someone thought that, hey, being able to move the cup just with my mind would be interesting, right? That's crazy, but that's an inspiration, you know, that you can trace it back to, okay, why someone thought about that? Why was that interesting? And the fact that so many of the things that are happening today actually were in Star Trek is not a coincidence. It's because one affects the other. You know, there is someone put out there in imagination, then there is someone who has certain technical capabilities and draw inspiration from those because they saw that TV show when they were kids, right? So it's actually quite interesting to think about that.
So for something like HoloLens, which you worked on, first of all, what was the problem at hand that you were trying to solve? And second, where did you find inspiration, or where did you look for inspiration?
So a project like HoloLens, there are many people that worked on it. And in general, the idea of holograms or augmented reality is something that has been, you know, in literature or science fiction for years. Everybody have in mind the idea of Star Wars holograms and whatnot, right? So there is in the collective imagination, there was already the idea that, hey, one day we'll be able to see digital content, for example, a map around this table. It's not something new. It's more about when are you able to make that happen? And there's a convergence of technologies that make it so that certain things that we that we have been imagining now can happen. It's interesting to see how the gap between fantasy and science fiction and reality is kind of closing down. So we think about self-driving car. Oh, we have self-driving cars.
What's your difference between science fiction and fantasy?
Science fiction is rooted in science. It's something that potentially can happen. A fantasy doesn't have to be rooted in that at all. But it's still super fascinating, right? Because if anything, it means that it's something that you wish without being constrained by any reality, and that's actually pretty nice. You know? So I think that there are certain things that at a certain point can happen. The idea that you can talk with technology is something that was possible, or people thought about it many years ago. It just happened now that maybe we are getting there. Same thing, virtual reality. There was a wave of virtual reality, a few decades ago, but the technology was not quite ready to make it happen. Maybe now is going to be the time. Maybe not. We're still waiting for flying cars. We're still waiting for hoverboards. But it's interesting because that imagination represents people's desire. So maybe someone will want to, if someone cracked the hoverboard, probably someone would want to buy it.
But isn't there a hoverboard? I thought I saw one. I mean, it's on this very specific, it was a car commercial, wasn't it?
There is, I'm not aware of all hoverboards that we made, but the one that I've seen is basically using magnets on top of a specific surface.
Yeah.
So, but you can imagine how, there are certain futures that are going to be possible. One question we should ask ourselves, what is the future that we want to live on? Because there's, science fiction, there are horrible things that we have imagined. For example, one that makes me laugh is time travel. Apart from Back to the Future, I cannot think about a movie where it doesn't go wrong. So I feel like before we make that happen, we should, have a good story of what's the deal, because it seems like someone dies.
Yes, or a lot of people die.
I would take a time travel machine right now to go back a couple of years. Yeah.
So it's also interesting to look back at, for example, ancient Greeks or Romans, the idea of the gods that they had. It was, their idea of what if we had superpowers. It's interesting because then the idea that you can fly, the idea that someone can use, the natural elements, et cetera, are all manifestation of a desire that someone had, And we're going to have a future where maybe, we are going to try to make some of these things happen, live forever, for example. Even if you think about Superman, it's a manifestation of the idea of something that we consider being great, that you can be super strong, that you can fly, that you have superpowers. It's fascinating.
Okay, I'm just going to say this. If there's somebody at the table who's going to fuck up our future, it's not me. So how much of this shit do we need?
So it's actually interesting because...
I say this because I was just watching a sci-fi movie, the X-Men one, where they have to, Wolverine is sent to the past to stop them weaponizing Raven's mutation ability because it creates these sentinels that destroy the world. Again, bad things happening when time travel happens.
I think it's super interesting, and people need to talk about it. That is, for example, what, now there is a lot of conversation around artificial intelligence. Right? Unless we talk about it, things will just happen without necessarily having the conversation at the table. For example, self-driving cars are about to happen, but we need to talk about it because someone will have to make some regulations. Like the MIT did an amazing project called Moral Machine, in which basically shows a car, which is a self-driving car, which has a brake failure. And the car needs to decide whether it's going to go straight or intervene. If it goes straight, it knows that will, let's say, kill 3 people. If it goes on the left, something else will happen.
Yeah.
We need to have a discussion, about, hey, what do we want to happen, right? And artificial intelligence is another case. So as designers or creators or innovators in general, I think that we have the responsibility and opportunity to influence what's happening to create a desirable future scenario. We need to have in mind, hey, we need to steer the boat towards this direction or this direction.
Well, that brings up another question about the hive mind mentality. And when we're talking about these big teams you're talking about, I think there's a much greater chance that, ideas that might have future consequences. I mean, I just did an illustration for the Times. This relates, it doesn't, maybe it does. About this group that's sending messages out into outer space. And, there's this whole discussion now about what it really means is we are inviting someone to destroy us. That there's
what are they saying? What
they're just saying,
we are delicious.
They're sending,
like that?
They're sending patterns that it's a greeting. But it's not hello,
greeting.
But there are patterns that conceivably could be understood by another race of people out there. But no, the reason I mention is because they're talking about I'm trying to think of the right way to describe it. It's not, there's no one saying you should do this or you shouldn't do this. Is this a good idea? Is this not a good idea based on how it might affect all of us in the future?
That's a question for me then to you. Is you talk about your sort of your personal philosophy. I think is to you're trying to do things that make people's lives better. I would argue that those guys probably think they are going to make our lives better by doing so. At what point do who's the arbiter of that at that point? How do you decide if that's something that is good or is bad?
I think it's very hard to say. I think that every time a new technology, we embrace a new technology, we have been always scared about that. We are scared about books. We burn books because they were evil. We're scared about TV, photos, steal your soul, etc. It's normal. But technology, being technology, is not good or evil, but it can be more or less dangerous. That's for sure. And I think it's about the culture and society that we have that is important to have conversations about why we do something. If you think about if you zoom out and we look at humanity as a whole, you might say that self-driving cars are going to remove a lot of jobs, or you could also say that they're going to save 30,000 lives in the US only every year. So I think it's about having these discussions.
But it will also be interesting for designers to actually participate more actively in that public discourse, right? When it is about writing regulations, etc. We're not known to sitting at these tables or to influencing those discussions.
Yeah, so I think it's up to us to get involved, because otherwise we let things happen. And so we need to make sure that the people that are working on those fields open up and talk to others, and we take decisions as a collective, because there are decisions that that the world is making that affect many people. Has always been the case, but more and more we feel like we are one village, and it should be an opportunity to become a collective intelligence that discuss. But yeah, it's definitely complicated. It's not easy.
So I guess ultimately the question becomes, maybe for each of you, is what role does or can or design should play as we head forward? As designers, I guess, maybe even as individuals, where do you see design headed, and how can it make the world a better place?
Just one comment, or in that realm, before so many years where disruption was the golden word, and we had so many conferences, and I don't know, under that title, and it was the sort of seemed to be the magic sauce for everything. And I think designers really forgot about the consequences too, and who are actually the parts of society that may not, cannot potentially actively engage in the consequences of the disruption in a positive way. And I think that's the other part where we should become a bit more aware of, that we're not just designing for millennials and for digital natives, etc. But what are the wider consequences when parts of society sort of, or acts in society sort of start to reside only in the digital realm? What are the wider consequences for the people who don't participate so easily?
But you know what? None of us, no designer knows what the consequences are. I mean, I'm a designer, but I also know that designers can't help but design, and that any problem that's solved, some unexpected things come out always, and it's just always going to be the case, isn't it?
I think.
But we don't need to necessarily just ignore it. It's also it's almost just also another problem that we might have answers to, and that we might think about, but it's so easy to even not to ignore it and to not think about it. And I think part of what we also in the political realm experience right now is also a consequence of that ignorance.
Well, what you're talking about is perpetual. We're always going to be perpetually needed, because whatever we design is going to fuck up, and then we're going to have to figure that out. And then we
figure out the mess.
Exactly. So cheers.
That's a great way to end it. So thank you, guys. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.